Hello, everyone. Welcome back to debate class. In this week, the theme is culture, and we'll be debating about the motion this house would make it illegal for anyone under 18 to play violent video games. So I'm sure everyone who's listening to this video all have experience playing video games through your PC, tablet, or smartphones. Video games are a popular activity for everyone, and many people say that video games are fun or they play it as a hobby or even jobs. But in today's debate, we'll zoom into one section of the video game which involves fighting, killing, or any sort of violence, which is the intention to hurt or kill a subject in the game. So the question here is, do violent video games contribute to young people being violent? According to the Center on Media and Health and Child, 97% of US kids aged 12 to 17 play video games, while 56% of teens aged 13 to 17 play video games for more than an average of 2.5 hours per day. So you can see a lot of teenagers and preteens pay a lot of money as well as time in playing these video games. But one thing to note is that what games are they playing in the first place? Research shows that many of the games that show violence, such as shooting or fightings, are the games that gain most popularity amongst people. In fact, in United States alone, more than half of the 50 top selling video games contain violence. Okay, so we see violence in video games. So what makes it so concerning to some people? Well, due to the advanced technology in graphics and with virtual reality, VR for short, video games are getting more and more realistic. If you see on the left, this is a screenshot of a very controversial violent video game called Death Race, released back in 1976. This game makes a car run over gremlins and was banned due to its violence after people protested. Okay, so that was the violent video game back in the 70s. But how about now? We can see the images are much more gory and bloodier. And now people are flocking into using VR video games, making the bloody scenes even more realistic than before. So the question is this: should we get worried about children and teens playing these violent video games which are so realistic? Does playing violent video games cause violence in our real lives? Well, some people say it does. Critiques of violent video games argue that playing violent video games desensitizes players to real-life violence and is responsible for the increased rates of bullying. According to Pacer's Natural Bullying Prevention Center, in 2007, 32% of students aged 12 to 18 reported that they're being bullied at school, compared to only 5% in 1999. The controversy over violent video games got major attention after the following massacre of 13 students in Columbine High School back in April 1999. The two teenage shooters were revealed to be avid players of weapon-based combat games called Doom. Similar shooting happened in 2012 in Sandy Hook Elementary School, where 26 people, mostly young children, were killed by a gunman. CBS News reported that these mass killings were also motivated by playing violent video games. But then again, is video game really the reason why people are violent and all of a sudden killing each other? Defenders of violent video games argue that the research does not show a link between video games and real-world violence. Research done by Christopher Ferguson also supports this, where he showed how US computer and video game software sales increased almost 200% from 1994 to 2014. But then murders by juvenile acting alone fell 76%. So the violent crime rates dropped almost 36% during the same period. Other critiques also argue that violent video games are not only coming from the video game alone, but causes can be from family breakups, domestic violence, or even psychological trauma when these people have to go through. So at this point, you may wonder, has government really tried to make illegal to sell these violent video games to children? Yes, there were attempts, such as state of California, which tried to pass a law that criminalized the sales of violent video games to under 18. But they were all struck down because there were claims that there were no relationship between playing violent video games and being violent. Meanwhile, video game empire is growing at a speed of light, and in 2018, video games generated sales of US 134.9 billion annually. Okay, so I hope all these information got you thinking about the motion, whether we should make it illegal for kids to play violent video games or not. So let's look at some arguments for this motion. If you're in the pro team, you should really try to say it's the value where we want to say it's the government's duty to protect its own citizens. And you want to make it into your stance that banning violent video games benefits the society, children, and the nation. The first argument I can think of is that violent video games causes violent behaviors. As if you're the pro team, you should really focus on giving some real examples to show why violent video games cause people to be violent. There are many examples that I just gave, such as the Sandy Hook Elementary School shootings or even the Columbine High School example. But more importantly, because these video games are so real, and if you play a lot of it, some people actually believe that people will become desensitized to violence. So they think it might be okay to go out and shoot people in real life. You can also say if you play a lot of violent video games, it brings social interaction problems with young children. Even the adults who play a lot of video games sometimes are a little bit confused about what is real and what is not. And if young children, especially the teenagers, play a lot of video games when they're young, then this might allow them to not really think about what is the proper social interaction between people. You can also say that even if you try to be careful, maybe your younger siblings or people who are even younger can actually see the violent video games played by adults or teenagers, and they can learn from it. So the harms can also inflict on a wider scale of audience in the family. Lastly, you can say if you make it illegal to sell video games, violent video games to children, it will send a very strong message to the video game makers to stop putting violence and gore to the industry. After all, these video game makers want to make money, and if they want to reach out to a wider audience of teenagers and young children, then if we make it illegal, then slowly but surely these industry will start to change and they will put less violence in the video game. Now, those were the arguments from the pro side. What about in the con side of this motion? Now, if you're on the con side, you can say, look, we want to value the freedom of individuals' choice. And the stance here is that if you ban video games, it does not really help to solve the issue of violence, but it will only bring harmful side effects. So the first argument here is that if you want to make your child responsible, do not go around hurt people and stop being a bully, then the responsibility is not the video game, but it is from the parents. Parents in school have the responsibility to upbring the child to be responsible kids. Secondly, you can also say it's not the video games that drive violent behavior. Now, just on a few slides before, I talked about whether violent video games really are the reason or not. People who don't believe it is the reason can show a lot of data that more and more kids are playing violent video games, but the murder rates are going down. Or you can say that violence is caused by psychological trauma or domestic violence. So you can say it's not really the direct relationship. Thirdly, you can say that violent video games prevent violent behavior. Now, this one is more because that if you have some aggression or if you're really stressed out, if you play video games, then you can actually release that stress and that can actually channel your stress away. And as a result, this will make people less stressed and more calm and peaceful in their everyday lives. So you can see that this is actually a benefit of playing some video games that involve shooting. So if you ban video games for young children or even adults, then this means that they'll get more and more stressed and they might actually become more violent. Lastly, you can also talk about some of the good things about video games, how it increases your motor skills or your some of your navigational skills. Now, there are some studies that shows that video games do help you to gain intelligence. So you can also say that video games do improve some skills, and you should not necessarily ban it for teenagers or children. So these were some of the arguments that I can think of on both pro and con side. But more importantly, I want you to have a read in the readings that I sent you out and also try to research more on your end. Until then, thank you for listening to my video and I'll see you in the debate.